Matt Schauf is a fantasy analyst at DraftSharks who hosts the award-winning DraftSharks podcast. He's a two-time Fantasy Pros IDP accuracy champion, he's a main event league champ, and most importantly, he's a dad. These are his late-round perspectives. This episode is sponsored by Underdog. Underdog is the easiest place to play fantasy sports, and they give you a ton of different games and contests to choose from each week. If you think drafting is over because the season started, you'd be wrong. You can draft teams over there each week in literal minutes. Right now, if you sign up on Underdog with promo code LATEROUND, you not only get a deposit offer of up to $1,000, but you also get access to my rest of season rankings. Those will be emailed to you once you sign up. But when you sign up, you have to use promo code LATEROUND. Head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the app to do so. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. Good to see you, man. So you're up in like what is it, Rochester area, right?
You got it. Just got our first real snow of the year, and by that I mean I didn't have to shovel yet, so I guess probably not real by our standards. But my neighbor had a snowblower out at least.
Yeah, it doesn't totally count because I'm down in Charlotte, and we had a dusting yesterday, right? So we woke, or 2 days ago, we woke up and we had like an inch and a half or so. Like it was.
So school's closed for the week.
Yeah,
right?
Right. Like it took me like twice the amount of time to get my son to daycare and stuff. But he's turning 2 in December, so next month, or I guess this month. Wow, we are in December right now. He turns 2 in like a few weeks, and he had never seen snow before, and because he's born here and all that, and he walked outside. And he was just like his reaction was snow, and he was just pointing right every time. And then he more, and he kept saying more to all the snow that was because he had never it was just so vast to him because it was literally just like everywhere. Very adorable thing to see. But yeah, I mean it's just different because did you grow up in the New York area and stuff?
I grew up kind of all over. I was actually born in North Carolina, so
cool.
it probably took me a while to see snow. I don't remember the first time, but then I lived in Cincinnati for a while, so we got some there. South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and then settled in New York from college on.
Man, you've been in a lot of places that I've lived too, because I'm in North Carolina now. Lived in Cincinnati for a little while. I was in Pittsburgh. That's where I was born and raised. Where in Cincinnati did you live?
So I was too young to really know the areas.
Gotcha.
I went to Pleasant Ridge Elementary School.
Okay.
I went to CBA, which is a bilingual academy. And
cool.
it was, so I guess I was close to Norwood for anybody who's familiar with that area.
Yeah, cool. And then, I was born and raised Pittsburgh, as most people probably associate me with more than anything, just because, especially like back in the day when I started the fantasy stuff, I was a more obnoxious Steelers fan than I am, today. Does that mean you're a big Bills guy?
No, I became an Eagles fan like right around Randall Cunningham time. That was such a fun team. And that was before I moved to Philly. And then I moved to Philly and was there when they hired Andy Reid.
Oh,
so
sweet.
I liked Andy Reid, I remember, as a coaching candidate. Everybody's like, who's this guy? He's the quarterback coach from Green Bay. I'm like, I don't know. He was at his initial press conference, hadn't even been hired yet. He's got a binder. Let's give him a shot, see what happens.
Yeah.
It was a pretty fun team to really get in on. And then, I mean, as I've gotten older, I don't care nearly as much. I still like when the Eagles win, but my day's not affected by it.
That's how I am too. It's like, it's hard to describe because I still am enjoying, I'm really enjoying the Steelers team, right? Like it's a incredibly fun team, and like the Russell Wilson story is really fun, and like Mike Tomlin's probably the easiest coach to root for and all of that, right? But it's just a different kind. Like when I was a late teenager and into my 20s and stuff, like I would, like you said, like it would either like make or break my week depending on whether or not they won. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember just being angry that the Eagles lost or that North Carolina lost in basketball. Yeah. And now I'm like, why? What did that do to me? It had absolutely no effect.
But here's the thing. I can't pinpoint if it's what we do for a living that's helping us have that perspective, or if it's just maturity and age and like having a family, if it's all of that.
Part of it's maturity, but it can't just be that because not everybody, I guess, grows all the way up. I can pinpoint it for me. It was in college. I had history of sport as part of my sports studies minor. And I had a professor named Dr. Mosier who, I signed up for this class as a teenager. I'm like, history of sport. I know all things about sports history. I'm going to crush this class. Yeah. And then on the first day, I realized, no, it's not history of sports. it's history of sport. And, just like the things that we went into with that, I was like, oh, this is about a lot more than whether the blue team beats the white team this day. It just, from that point on, it just kind of dwindled. And then, I had kids, and it's like, if you have kids and your day is ruined or made by what happens on a game on TV, then there's something wrong, probably.
Yeah. Well, you get a lot of, I think that you get a ton of perspective too, just on like even in fantasy, right? Like this past week, I had the probably top 3 worst fantasy beat of my life, because it's going to impact so many things about like the playoff picture and me maybe not making the playoffs in this league. Despite like, here let me just give you a quick summary. My home league that I commish, okay, this is one where there's like a meme essentially with my buddies where I'm like cursed in this league. And in this league that I commish, we get 6 playoff spots. The final playoff spot is most points not in, right? So we get, if you get bad luck with all that, whatever. I might finish second in the league in points for and not make the playoffs. That's how. And I lost this past week by 0.1 because David Njoku dropped a pass at the end of that game. And I've never you get that like sinking feeling. But then again, going back to like the perspective and stuff, it's like it's really hard to like let that sit with you for more than a couple days at most, because you're just like, okay, like we play in a lot of leagues. You and I play in leagues together. Like, we're going to be on the other side of that eventually. It's just that in this instance, I have a dominant team that's probably going to miss the playoffs, and it's pretty tilting, but we can get over it.
Yeah, I had 2 years ago now in a drafters tournament, I was in position to maybe win it. And then I had Stephon Diggs in my lineup for the infamous DeMar Hamlin game that ultimately never happened, and we never got points for, and I finished 4th. So I had to tell myself that, all right, 4th is still a lot more money than if you didn't finish up there. Even though, the funniest part about it is I held off telling my wife that I was close to it because I didn't want her to be like, hey, we might get $10,000, but we might not. I was waiting. And then the last week I was like, I got to tell her so that she knows why I'm watching it this closely. And of course, then that happened.
Yeah. And especially in like a DFS type game or like a best ball tournament or something like that, you're also like, you almost feel like you've earned that money and then you lose that money in a way, but it's like, it was technically never in your hands and, in the first place. You got to at least, like have that standpoint and perspective on it. But, you mentioned a little bit so you got a minor in sport history or something. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Sport with no S on the end. Studies was my minor.
Sport studies. Okay. So what got you into that? I want to know your path, your history, and how you got from a sports studies minor to being at Fantasy Sharks and doing the work that you're doing now.
DraftSharks.
That's what I meant. Oh, sorry. DraftSharks. Yes, of course.
So yeah, I was at Ithaca. I was in the communications school. I went to school planning to be on Sports Center, and then quickly realized I didn't really like the TV production stuff that much. Switched to journalism. So I was a journalism guy with a sports studies minor. And I mean, honestly, what I probably got into it first for was because it was sports studies, and I didn't realize the difference between sports and sport. So it was just kind of a natural minor to go with my journalism if I was going to be this sports journalist.
Yeah.
But like I said, history of sport was just an example, and it would get boring to get into it, but there was stuff like psychology of sport and, just all the different angles and things at play around sports that I learned more about through that, as opposed to, just studying the history of sports.
Yeah.
It made everything a lot more interesting. I don't know that specifically had any impact on me getting to fantasy though. I've just always been a sports fan. Like when my brothers and I were younger, we would read the sports pages. We would trade baseball cards. Baseball was my big sport growing up.
Yeah.
I, enjoyed football as well, but I loved baseball. There's no more stat dense sport than that. So I've always just kind of been in that and didn't really play fantasy until I was in college. And then finally, the guy who became my advisor in college, I think that's the first actual fantasy league I played in. He was running it. He started up a league. Asked me to join, and we would have these advising sessions to set my schedule. We had set my schedule in 2 minutes because we were like, you take this, and this. All right, now here's what I think about this coming season. And we'd talk fantasy football, fantasy baseball. I won his league the first year. And then from there I was like, oh, I kind of like this game. I think we'll keep building on this. And that was the beginning of college. So, there were other steps along the way from there.
Yeah. And then after college, how did this all come about?
Well, JJ, the year was 2002. TikTok was merely a sound that clocks made.
Look, you say that, but I did have Bob Harris on earlier this offseason, and no, I'm just kidding.
He'll understand.
Love you, Bob. Love you, Bob.
So he'll understand this next part. I worked at a thing called a newspaper, which, I mean, your grandparents can tell you about, in Oneonta, New York. And I had interned there during college, went back there after college, and the sports editor, I was apparently the only guy on staff at that point that played fantasy, which shows you like it's been 22 years since then. Seems like a long time if you're young. It's really not that long in the evolution of fantasy, but it's gone from me being the only person at a newspaper to play it to now Chris Collinsworth is talking during the game about playing against his son.
Right.
So I'm there. The sports editor's like, hey, you're the only one here who plays fantasy. Do you want to do a fantasy column? And I'm like, I don't know if I know enough to do a fantasy column, but all right. I'm arrogant enough to give it a shot. So I did that, enjoyed it. And then I was like, I wonder if there's any more out there. I just kind of searched online. I found the FSWA, which is Fantasy Sports Writers Association. I found they had job postings at that point, and I found Pro Fantasy Sports run by Mike Beacom, who said he needed writers. And I didn't know what for. I was like, all right, hey, I'm interested in writing. What do you need? And he was like, hey, I need somebody to do an IDP start sit column. And what was funny about that at the time is I had just before that convinced my league, then my only league, to drop IDPs because I didn't like it. It didn't make sense the way we were playing it. And I don't know, we could get into that now or in a minute because I know we're going to talk about IDPs. But I started doing that and I was like, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it well. Like I'm not going to half-ass this IDP start bench. So I dug into it, got to know the guys, wrote about them every week, enjoyed that. I was like, hey, there's not that much IDP content out there. Let me see who needs it. I found the Sporting News. I reached out to the Sporting News. I was like, hey, how would you guys like an IDP column? Here's some of my stuff. They're like, sure, do an IDP column for us. And then, it was that kind of thing too, where I just found different opportunities. Pro Fantasy Sports got bought by another company, which had more work for me. I eventually met Lenny, who is the creator of DraftSharks, Lenny Papano. Got on with them after I left my previous company. So it's a mix of, getting out there, finding stuff, obviously doing the work once you're there, but, some luck certainly mixed in along the way. Like Lenny and DraftSharks are based here in Rochester, where I just happened to land. So that certainly helped us, join up, which is like 13, 14 years ago now.
Yeah, that's crazy. Is it common that people slip up and actually accidentally say fantasy instead of draft whenever they're referring to DraftSharks? I can't believe I said that whenever I said that, but it's just one of those things. Yeah. I
think DraftKings happens more often now, actually.
Oh, that makes sense. Sharks. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So you mentioned that you're, you have a backbone, if you will, and background with IDP. You're an IDP guy. I don't think I've had an IDP analyst on Perspectives. This is like episode 40, like late 40s at this point, and I haven't had any IDP discussions. You're shaking your head right now because
we're used to being treated like that.
Yeah, this is a common thing for you IDP folks. But look. I want to clear the air. I want to open things up to you. I want you to convince folks that are listening as to why they should be playing IDP. And why we're missing out. Because look, I don't even really play that much IDP either, which is probably a mistake because I'm a fantasy football analyst.
Yeah. So here's the first question for somebody who's actually interested. If somebody is, strongly opposed and they're like standing their arms folded and saying, convince me, don't play it. You're going to find something you hate about it and it's going to be a fake reason. So don't play it. My question to anybody who's actually interested is, do you like fantasy football? And if the answer is yes, it's the exact same game on the other side. It's just different players and different stat categories. I mean, I don't know about everyone else's experience. I think, though, probably most people who play fantasy and who enjoy it, who are actually into it, know a lot more about football right now, even if that's just like paying attention to every team, knowing a lot more players, realizing more of what's going on, realizing who's playing well, who's not, who's hurt, who's not. So if you get that from playing fantasy, you're still ignoring half of the game by not playing with the defensive side, because you get the exact same thing. If you add in defensive players, now you're paying attention to those guys. Now you know who's hurt over there. Now you know who's performing well or not. Now you know who's delivering stats or not. I think that one thing, the reason I talked my league out of doing it initially was because we did the thing where we had, I believe it was 3 defensive players at first, and might have even gone down to 2 that next year. And that's the wrong way to do it. Anybody who plays like that is going to come away with the wrong impression. And that's, I know that there are plenty of leagues that do that. So you can do it. It obviously does work, but it's the same as having 3 offensive positions and having every quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end available to fill those 3 spots. Right. Everybody in your league can get good players there. Right. And every week, somebody's not going to score the way you're expecting him to. And it's going to make it look like it's completely luck driven. Yeah, and that's what I get a lot from people is, oh, it's all luck on defense. I'm like, dude, last week, Adam Thielen, Parker Washington, and Nick Westbrook-Akine were top 8 fantasy receivers. If you think that there's that big a difference between the offensive and defensive side from a luck standpoint, it's just because you haven't actually played and paid attention to IDP.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've been in a lot of leagues. I have played in IDP before, to be clear. So I've experienced it. It's just been a minute because it didn't really keep up. And I feel like, interest kind of waned a little bit. But there are a lot of leagues that, like you mentioned, where it seems like people just like, I don't know if it's the commissioner just being power hungry and thinking that they're getting cute or something. Like, I don't really understand the logic behind it, but they end up just throwing 1 or 2 IDP spots in there. And of course, just think if you were to do that in the reverse. If you had an IDP, if you had a defensive lineup, and then you just had a random super flex spot or something, like literally everyone's super flex spot is going to be really, really good. And then you're going to have like these random running backs that are very good, like a Kyron Williams on the waiver wire or something like that. And it's like, yeah, this is silly. This is stupid. So you're saying that you think people should go, and this makes a lot of sense, but people should kind of go all in if they're going to really try out IDP.
Yeah, and even within that, there are levels. I think you need to start with at least 5 defensive positions, because that's enough to require at least 1 D lineman, at least 1 defensive back, and then you can do kind of whatever you want with the other 3. Like, you don't usually need to require linebackers, because in most formats, they're at least equal with the other guys, if not, stronger with their scoring. And there, are wide scoring variations. So, that differs quite a lot by league. Ideally, I think you get to the point where you're also requiring defensive tackles specifically, cornerbacks specifically, because, DB seems like a catch-all, but there's a big difference between playing safety and playing cornerback, and the kind of numbers you put up and how consistently you get tackle opportunities and all that. And, choose whatever level works for you. I think starting with at least 5 is for the league that's like, yeah, we'll try IDP, but not everybody's ready to jump in yet. And then if you play it and everybody's into it, then you can, ramp it up to the point where there's many defensive starters as there are offense. And, that's going to sound weird to people who are used to just fantasy being offense, but there are more defensive players available. Like, every time you look at the field, 5 guys on offense are not fantasy viable because they're offensive linemen. On the other side of the ball, every single guy is fantasy viable. Obviously, to much different degrees. There are lots of defensive tackles that barely do anything stat-wise, but all those guys put up some stats at some point.
I mean, look, in my offensive line only league, they are relevant. They're pancakes that they're able to acquire and accumulate for that league. No, so are you, from like your league standpoint, like the leagues that you manage, are you in leagues where it's just wild and crazy with IDP, like more IDP than more defensive players than offensive and such?
Well, to be clear, I don't commish any leagues because I have enough trouble staying on top of managing my own teams during the season, like making sure I don't forget waivers coming up, especially when they're on different days. So I've definitely played a wide variety, larger lineups, the smaller lineups, the crazy rules, defense only. I really like it when it's balanced, where the defensive guys are as important as offense. I'm certainly not looking for it to get more important, but I think, both sides of the ball matter quite a bit in actual football. So I like when they're both affecting each other. I play in one league. Sigmund Bloom's one of my league mates there. It's called Goyd on Roids, but that's got, lots of lineup spots on both sides and the kind of scoring that makes everybody important. And it makes the draft the most fun draft that I do all year, because, the second round could be half the teams taking quarterbacks. Somebody takes a defensive end, somebody takes an edge linebacker, and you don't know if you're doing it right until you get to the end and see what team you have.
Yeah, that's the thing that I've always thought about with draft strategy. And like I've been, obviously I dig into draft strategy a ton and game theory a ton during the off season and stuff. And I'm trying to do studies and see what's optimal and all that kind of stuff. But there's only so many iterations that you can really go with when you're only dealing with 4 different position groups, right? Like you could say, okay, I'm going to go early, mid, late with any of these positions and kind of mix that up. Or I'm going to, like we've obviously, come up with all these different ideas with like hero RB, zero RB, and robust RB, and all these different like strategies and stuff. But there's really not like, there's a line that we can actually draw and say, okay, these are all of the strategies. Like in terms of like when you're picking these particular positions, now it's more so like the kind of archetypes that you're taking and the types of players that you're taking and stuff. But I would imagine with IDP, you're able to really just get wild, like you're saying, because there are just so many more positional groups that you can, if the scoring evens things out enough, you could really go wild with it.
Yeah, and there's just so much more room for drafting differently. And I mean, that's my favorite part of fantasy is not just the draft, but being ready to adjust during the draft. I feel like it might be my top strength in playing fantasy. It's certainly what I enjoy the most is getting into a draft and figuring out what I need to do as I go. Obviously we do lots of drafting along the way, so I'm ready with a basic strategy, but I like the adjusting. And I think the more positions you put in there, the more room there is for adjusting and seeing what your adjustments do to other people in your league. Like I like taking, if I'm like, hey, the league's not dipping into defense early enough, I'm going to take this top guy here and I'm going to see if that starts a run. And then I'm going to get, this guy on offense later than I should or whatever it is. But anything that you can do to make the draft more interesting, I'm in favor of.
Yeah. I'm more of a fan of like weird roster construction in terms of starting lineup requirements. Like we do the Going Deep League every year that Mike Clay put together. And, you get the super flex, 3 running backs, 6 wide receivers, 2 tight ends. It's tight end premium. It's pretty wild, like setup in general, but it at least like I'm not as big of a fan of like massive scoring variations. Like I'd rather just kind of know what we're working with in terms of like how players accumulate points, but I'm more interested in that supply and demand change and shift, because to me that's what like the Going Deep League, like the drafts are always completely unpredictable. I never really know what people are really thinking unless Sean Siegel's in the draft, which he generally is. He's going wide receiver generally. But yeah, it's fun to experience those different iterations and stuff. So
I agree with that. The other thing about the scoring variations thing is that the more of those there are, the more luck you're building into the weekly scoring during the season. And that's the part that I like to try to minimize. Yes. Obviously we know that there's lots of luck involved anyway. And that's kind of the point, is why introduce more of it by having these crazy scoring things that, only allow so much prediction.
Yeah. Sometimes you commish leagues too, where you have a spot in the playoffs for most points not in because of the schedule luck, and you still don't make the playoffs despite having the second most points in that league. Anyway, I'm definitely over it. I promise I'm over it. All right. Let's talk about what's gone on in this 2024 season. To me, it just seems like it's been kind of a weird season. I don't know if like it's been like totally unpredictable or, it's not like my teams are like overly strong. It's a pretty normal season for me overall. It just seems like it's been a little bit weird because running backs are staying really healthy. They've dominated too, a lot of them, a handful of them. Wide receivers haven't been as reliable. Some of the earlier round tight ends, all of the tight ends started off really slow. Some of them have finally, emerged. But a lot of them, whether it's Kyle Pitts or like a Dalton Kincaid, have generally just been busts. My question to you is, we know that year over year, we generally see an overcorrection and overreaction to what happened the previous season. What do you think we're going to be able to take advantage of in next year's drafts?
I mean, recency bias is always the thing. And it's one of the things I enjoy about the early drafting now is you start getting early reads on who people are going to be taken too early. And, it's certainly different what we can take advantage of best ball wise versus home leagues eventually in August, where lots of things change. I think these running backs are probably going to get pushed up more. Yeah. And, you're talking about it being a weird season. The health thing is certainly on the weird side. I wonder if we should have realized that a bit more of the RB centric approach was coming by the league suddenly paying running backs. It's not a lot of them, but the star ones, Saquon Barkley getting his money, Derrick Henry getting his money. I wonder if we should have expected a bit more of that lean on those guys, especially when paired with the number of young wide receivers getting traded. Those are the kinds of things that I'm kind of watching for and figuring out if I need to learn something from it for next year or if it's just a quirky thing about this year. I think as far as the draft stuff goes, probably stud running backs are going to get pushed up the board, and people are not going to realize how much luck is involved in staying healthy through a season like Saquon Barkley's having. Just look at Christian McCaffrey's season last year, and I was wary of him heading into the year because of how difficult it is to get that much work and stay healthy. But, when it happens, obviously you end up with a monster fantasy campaign.
Do you think that, so I had this discussion with some other folks on the show in the past, but I'm curious on your take of this. So obviously these running backs like a Derrick Henry or a Saquon Barkley, and I know that like Henry's kind of cooled off versus him just scoring a touchdown every single week and just doing his thing. But do you think that people were against drafting running backs this year strictly because of the age factor? Like, do you think that them beating the age cliff, if you will, has played into sort of what's been going on this year? Or do you think that there's a multitude of factors at play as to why, Saquon, I've seen tweets this week, for instance, being like, I can't believe fantasy analysts had us drafting Breece Hall over Saquon Barkley this year, or what have you. And it's like, okay, very easy to say that in hindsight, of course, but like, why do you think a guy like Barkley or a guy like Henry, maybe Kyren Williams to a degree, but even Kyron's cooled off at least a little bit. But why do you think like Barkley, we can just focus on him. Like, do you think that people were nervous about the health and the age stuff and maybe his inefficiency? Or do you think that there were other factors like the situation itself for Saquon as to why he wasn't a clear first round pick and more of a second rounder?
I mean, specifically for him, I think it was primarily people moving away from running backs anyway.
Yeah.
Barkley didn't score like Breece Hall did last year, so that's easy. Everybody's going to draft Breece Hall ahead of Saquon Barkley because there wasn't a reason to. And really, going forward, we're going to keep drafting the 23-year-old dual threat running back over the 28, 29-year-old dual threat running back. That's always going to be the case. Granted, there will be some individual spots where we might switch it up, but that's just going to be the way it is. It hasn't worked out with Breece Hall this year, but that doesn't mean it won't next year. And if next year you're like, I listened to you guys last year and took Breece Hall, I'm not going to make that mistake again. Yeah, you are. You just make it in the other direction. Now I'm going to get Breece Hall and you're going to be mad at me again.
That's right.
So I think that's specific to Saquon Barkley, and also just the worry that he wouldn't get enough touchdowns with Jalen Hurts there. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that we all do, but especially us fantasy folks do too much in digging into the numbers, is being like, well, this is how many touchdowns we can expect, and this is how many Jalen Hurts scores. So either Jalen Hurts is going to get a disappointing number of touchdowns, or Saquon Barkley is going to get a disappointing number of touchdowns. And we don't do collectively enough of, well, wait a second, these guys are both awesome.
Yeah,
their offensive line is awesome. This team has been very effective at scoring rushing touchdowns. What if there's enough to support both of these guys? Maybe not to the optimal level of either one without the other one, but maybe there's enough to make both of these guys really good if they stay healthy.
Yeah, I mean, look, my biggest mistake with Saquon, I wasn't like from a positional ranking standpoint, I had him where most people had him. It wasn't anything wrong with that. It's more so, I had him. I had some wide receivers over him that I, like a Garrett Wilson or whatever, that obviously in hindsight we wouldn't want to do that. But I do, the thing that I got mad at myself about from an analysis standpoint is quite literally right before the season. It was in August. I did a mailbag episode and someone asked me about Saquon. And I answered the question saying that I thought that people were kind of overstating the touchdown thing because DeAndre Swift last year was top 10 in the league in goal line rushes. Like DeAndre Swift with Philadelphia was getting work at the goal line. It's just that obviously the tush push was there. It wasn't an enormous amount of work or as much as it could be if Jalen Hurts weren't involved. And then Philadelphia, to me, the big thing with Philly this year isn't even necessarily the touchdown scoring. It's just the fact that they've become so run dependent and run heavy. Like the defense plays lights out. Kellen Moore steps in. You're thinking to yourself, okay, they're going to be a relatively pass friendly team just because of his history and his pace history and stuff. It just hasn't been that way. And that to me, like Devontae Smith, when healthy, hopefully he can get things going now that Dallas Goedert is out. But like Devontae Smith, when healthy, has not really been doing his thing, even though we know that he's talented and his target shares are okay enough, but they're just not passing enough. And so the game scripts and the way the Eagles team itself kind of came together, it ended up being a perfect storm for Saquon Barkley. And I think it's okay for us to sit here and say that while also recognizing that we probably made some mistakes. Like you said, like draft good players on good teams. Sometimes it's that simple. But then also let's not overstate these narratives about what Jalen Hurts is going to be doing in terms of the overall touchdown pie. Like there's still probably enough work there for Saquon Barkley to begin with.
Yeah. And I think beyond the Barkley situation, it's just another example of thinking about the what if. Like we're concerned about if there are going to be enough touchdowns for these guys, but kind of ignoring that this team that never pays for a running back suddenly paid up for one of the best running backs in the league. It's like, what if they're telling us by doing that they're going to run a ton? They think this guy is special and they're going to create opportunities for him. Now, he has still needed to stay healthy. We couldn't have reasonably predicted him to lead the league in carries to this point, I guess, with the quarterback and them both getting all those touchdowns. But, it's just considering that what if and like really considering the full range of outcomes, and then also kind of reacting to the way that people are reacting in the draft. I think we do a lot of falling into ADP now because we talk about how much smarter drafters are and how smart ADP is at this point. Yeah. There's still things that you should adjust to. Like if Saquon Barkley was going 6th overall in drafts, I'd be like, yeah, I'm not really drafting Saquon Barkley. Yeah. But if he's going in round 2, I'm like, I'm going ahead and take him there. And if he stays healthy, he's going to at least be fine. Yeah,
that's the thing. It's like what you're saying is, if he's a 1-2 turn pick, right? Like, which is generally, home leagues probably went a little bit higher. Obviously, in some best ball leagues. I mean, I remember at one point during the off season in best ball, he was like a 2-3 turn pick. Like it was crazy how much people were fading him. That's when I was really buying him. And then, he rose a little bit as like more of the home leaguers and more casual players stepped in, and they ended up being right with the way that they were valuing Saquon. But like if Saquon were like the like based on everything that we're saying, and we knew that this was a possibility, or at least we were more open to it and we were just better at recognizing it, he probably still would have been like the 109, right? Like he would have never been like, we were never going to rank him above Breece Hall, like, or Bijan or something. Like it just didn't make
shouldn't have.
Yeah. Right. Like I think process wise, like I'm not really upset about that. I think though that we can recognize that there's still that gap where, 5 or 6 or 7 spots where he should have probably been a little bit higher than where he was drafted. But then you have to also just recognize that this has been a really, really good run out for him. Like this has been probably like 95th to 99th percentile type outcome for Saquon Barkley this year, which is fine. That's going to happen for some of these players. And, recognize where you were wrong, recognize where you can improve your process and hope for better results next year.
Yeah, I mean, we both know we're going to miss plenty of things every year. So it's about the main thing is figuring out what you missed that you shouldn't have. Yeah. And then what you missed that's like, that's okay. I can deal with missing that.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about quarterbacks. So, we've kind of gone through this journey of back in 2015, 2016, late round quarterback was like the most obvious strategy on the face of the earth. And then, you get into Lamar Jackson in his MVP season. And after that, people start to recognize that mobility matters a little bit more, and we start to see a little bit more consistency from the top quarterbacks. But this year, we've seen Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts do their thing, but there's been some, relative busts. Anthony Richardson, CJ Stroud, both drafted relatively early. Do you think that people are going to latch on to that and go with more of a late round quarterback strategy again next year?
I don't, because Lamar Jackson's still up there. His score currently would have led all of last year's quarterbacks. So I think it's just going to be him as the first quarterback. It's going to be Jalen Hurts up there somewhere close. It's going to be Josh Allen somewhere close to them. It's probably going to be Jaden Daniels going earlier than we want him to, just like Anthony Richardson was early in drafts last year. Like I don't know if you're like me, but I went into draft season like, oh, it's going to be fun to take some Anthony Richardson. And then I saw where people were taking him. I was like, guess I'm not taking any Anthony Richardson. Yeah. I think it's going to be more like that because, there are also plenty of busts at the other positions. So people are going to get to this point where they're like, I could take that wide receiver I don't trust, or I could take Lamar Jackson. I'm going to take Lamar Jackson and then I'm going to do my stacking thing. So I think it's going to continue with the elites going early. I'll be curious to see if behind that we start to see bigger gaps. Yeah. Because that was maybe more, I don't know if detrimental, but that's probably more effective in what happened previously is pushing the other quarterbacks up higher. Like I don't have a problem with the elite ones going early, even if they don't quite score to the level you're expecting. Like even this year, I thought Patrick Mahomes was going too early. So he's the one among those elites that I'm not taking. but I was fine taking Jalen Hurts. I was fine taking Josh Allen in that range. They haven't let us down.
Yeah.
Loved Jaden Daniels because of the upside that he's showing here. So I think we're going to get a new crop in, but I think ultimately people will draft pretty similarly.
Yeah, I kind of agree. My thing is that, like, and I try to push this a lot over the offseason, when we get pocket passing quarterbacks in those middle rounds and like early to mid rounds, like fringe top 6 guys, into that like 6 to 9 range, those guys generally don't have very strong hit rates, right? Like CJ Stroud was one of the most obvious of those, of that kind of like archetype of a guy who doesn't have the mobility. You really, really need an elite passing season from that player. And then if you look at like that range this year, right? Like Kyler was in that range, but he's obviously mobile, so he's not one of the pocket passer guys. But you had CJ Stroud, you had Jordan Love, Dak Prescott was kind of in there, and Joe Burrow was in there, right? And the one guy that's emerged out of that group is Burrow, but you look at what he's doing through the air, and he's playing out of his mind with a ton of passing volume, right? Like he needed these things to really come together for him to be this consistent fantasy asset. And he's still not, to the degree of like a Lamar or some of the mobile guys. And then, like that's the thing that I think folks should probably walk away with from this season is it's even clearer than it's ever been of that in that, like, you're going to have stretches where some of these pocket passers have good games. Like, it's inevitable because they're good quarterbacks. That's why they're being drafted where they're being drafted. But if a touchdown just goes on the ground versus through the air, like 1 or 2 of those in a given game, that guy's kind of sunk for that week. And they're a lot more replaceable with the Sam Darnold types that you're just going to throw darts at late in your draft than, someone like a Jalen Hurts or a Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson. So to your point, like, I think that there's a very real chance that we see, like, those 3 quarterbacks especially go in the first 3-4 rounds as we typically see. And then there not be a quarterback for like 3 rounds. Maybe Jaden Daniels would be thrown in there too, but there won't be a quarterback from an ADP perspective, like for 3 or 4 rounds after that. Do you think that's possible?
I think it's possible, but that's what I'm wondering is if people will allow that, or if they'll be pushing up the next set of guys.
Yeah.
And for me, the what to take advantage of is always a bit more specific like that. Like you brought up CJ Stroud, he and his receivers at their prices were the easiest fades on the board for me. Unfortunately, that included Nico Collins, which did not pay off for me, outside of when he was injured. But if I miss on Nico Collins, but also hit on CJ Stroud, Tank Dell, and Stephon Diggs, not paying off, then ultimately I think I'm winning that. And that to me is what I take away more, what I react to more each season, as opposed to the overall positional trends.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. Let's move on to some player takes. So Christian McCaffrey, he's on IR. Everyone had 24 hours of loving themselves for holding on to Jordan Mason, and then he went on IR. So now we get Isaac Guerendo stepping in, someone who didn't have like the best, I prospect mostly through data. I obviously watched the guys too, but didn't have the best production profile in college, but definitely has a size speed combination. Are you expecting him to step in and just be a workhorse for them? Or do you think there's a possibility that we see some sort of a split backfield there?
I'm not expecting him to be a workhorse. I'm open to the possibility that he is a workhorse. I think that San Francisco would probably prefer that he isn't, but they might not have that many other options. We know Patrick Taylor's a limited player. And I think the thing that I'm most interested in seeing in relation to this is whether and how many carries Deebo Samuel gets, because that I think is going to tell us what Kyle Shanahan thinks of Deebo Samuel right now. If he gets, any fewer than 4 carries in this weekend's game, that says that Kyle Shanahan is worried about Deebo Samuel to me, because when your first 2 running backs go down and you're left with Isaac Guerendo and other dudes, that should be Deebo Samuel running time. He ran 8 times. I think it was week 1 this season to open the year when they didn't have Christian McCaffrey and were going with Jordan Mason as a starter initially. Like, that's what they do. They're like, all right, we're going to give Deebo the ball more to make this thing work. So if they don't do that, then I think it's time to worry. I think, though, the reason that we should just, go feverish after Guerendo this week on waivers, which has already passed, but, we should probably play him higher than we would just about any other guy. A rookie stepping in as a first-time starter is just this record of Kyle Shanahan's. And I was looking at it just to remind myself how deep it goes. We all know the recent production. We can all probably remember Elijah Mitchell in 2021. We know that he brought Jeff Wilson Jr., Raheem Mostert, to the surface in the NFL, but it goes back beyond that. I think probably my favorite example, and looking back in it, is the one year that Kyle Shanahan was the OC in Cleveland. he got 16 total rushing touchdowns from Isaiah Crowell, Terrence West, and Ben Tate. So if you're a running back for Kyle Shanahan, you're scoring.
That's insane. Those names I haven't heard in so long.
Exactly.
I forgot Isaiah Crowell existed. Yeah, I'm with you. The other thing with like, it's like the meme, like the graph meme, like the parabola meme, right? Wherever like you have someone who's kind of like an open mouth breather just saying something, and then you put your glasses on, you really analyze the thing, and then you come to the realization that the mouth breather is actually right at the end of the day. And I think that's what we're looking at with Isaac Guerendo, where it's like fast and big, right? And like he could be a one cut runner, and that works in this kind of offense, right? Like that's it. Like we just need a guy who can run fast, that can get to the outside. I do think they're going to run a lot more perimeter runs than they have, throughout the season and stuff, because he's a different kind of runner than Jordan Mason is. But we've seen this kind of like archetype of a running back to some degree. Usually they're, like an Eli Mitchell or like Raheem Mostert are smaller than a Guerendo. But like when you have an athletic specimen like him in a Shanahan offense, you should probably feel pretty optimistic that things are going to at least like go semi his way. Like I'm not trying to fool anyone to say that like he was a really good prospect, because he really, to me, was not that great of a prospect on paper. He kind of comped to like an Isaiah Pacheco-ish, just a bigger bodied, kind of inefficient throughout college, and didn't get that like crazy production. Wasn't that much of a receiver, but he had the physical traits to be able to potentially translate. And we've seen him bust out some big runs already this year. Like we know that the big playability is there, but I really like your note about Debo. And I think we're going to learn a lot about Debo, like you said, and whether or not he's dust at this point, because he has been rough this season. Like one of the low key worst picks that you could have made in fantasy this year. Are you expecting the turnaround, or are you kind of just in wait and see mode right now?
I don't think that it's fair to expect a turnaround at this point. I'm in wait and see, and I think you can still play him in wide receiver 3 range this week while we're waiting to see, because I do think one of the things that could happen is they could give him the ball a good bit on the ground. I said if he doesn't get it, then we should worry, but if he does get it, then it's like, oh, okay, Debo's still alive. Things have just not been going his way. And that's kind of the other thing working in Guerendo's favor is if everybody was healthy in the passing game, San Francisco could be like, yeah, the rookie's going to start for us in the backfield, but we're probably going to throw it a little bit more. We've got Brandon Ayuk. We've got Debo doing his thing. We've got a fully healthy George Kittle. But, they've got Brock Purdy coming off his shoulder issue, no Ayuk, Debo with who knows exactly what's up. So I think that only helps the available touches for Guerendo. And yeah, it's I'm not giving up on Debo, but it's definitely like worry time.
Yeah, for sure. And, Ricky Pearsall just getting cardio every week at this point instead of, actually getting production for us. Let's talk about the Arizona Cardinals. Kyler Murray has had a roller coaster of a season. Should we be I talked about him a little bit on the 15 Transaction Show this week, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Should we be more optimistic or pessimistic about Kyler rest of season?
I think realistic is the way to be on him. I mean, to me, being optimistic is like, yeah, Kyler's going to be fine through the playoffs for me. Maybe that works out. To me, pessimistic is saying Kyler sucked lately. I'm not going to use him. I'm going to take Will Levis for the playoffs. That's probably not going to work out for you. So I think to be realistic with it is to keep Kyler Murray on your roster, to think he might be my quarterback throughout the playoffs and he might help me win my league. But this team is also not scared to go run heavy in a given game. They have been pass heavier in recent weeks, top half of the league in pass rate over expected over the past 4 weeks. So I'm not super worried that the pass volume is going to disappear, but they're not afraid to go run heavy in an individual game if they're feeling it, if they're controlling it. Certainly not afraid to give it to James Conner near the goal line. So I'm realistic. I did a fantasy football playoff strategy article. I have Kyler's schedule in there, which can be very helpful. I list him as somebody who could help you, but it's, with the caveat that I'm not sure exactly what we're getting from him because the numbers have been all over the place. Some of the big weeks have relied heavily on not only rushing touchdowns, but long rushing touchdowns. Yeah. So I'm not comfy just thinking that he's my QB1 no matter what the rest of the way.
Yeah, I had him as more like, a hold, like don't necessarily give up on him or anything like that, just because the schedule, like you noted, like they get Seattle, New England, Carolina, LA, the Rams, right? So that's overall on paper, not really that bad of a schedule. But to your point, I think there is still that fear, especially when they get New England and when they face Carolina. If some of those touchdowns end up just coming to on the ground or going to James Conner, instead of Kyler through the air, that can easily make or break. Even if they score 4 or 5 touchdowns in one of those games, if 4 of them are on the ground, then he might not have the passing volume to be able to be relevant enough. You want some of that more back and forth. But I think, probably still like a low end one, entering the playoffs because of just what the quarterback landscape kind of looks like right now overall.
He's still in QB1 range for us this week, even against a matchup where his team struggled last time.
Yeah, to me, I think I had him at like QB7 or 8 or something this week, because it's just the way that things kind of shape up right now and look. Let's talk about Breece Hall. So the Jets have, at least with my numbers, I don't know if your numbers show the same thing, but they have, I think, the best playoff schedule for running backs, in weeks 15, 16, 17. I use median to look at that. So, averages might skew it a little bit differently, but they have a great schedule. But he's banged up. He's got this knee issue. I don't think, we're recording this on Thursday. I always have to throw that caveat out there. So we have not watched the Thursday night game. We don't know who's playing yet this weekend, but I think he missed practice again today. He's got this knee issue. Are you worried about Hall from that perspective and from a deployment perspective too?
Well, first off, JJ, I do fantasy advice for a living, so I am worried about every single player every week.
That's fair. Yeah, that's very
But what I'm specifically worried about here is the knee, and I think that we all didn't pay enough attention to it last week, because when a player goes no practice Wednesday, limited Thursday, full Friday, we're like, all right, he's good to go, even if he's got a questionable tag, and especially if he's then active off that questionable tag. We're like, all right, well, Breece Hall, I'm definitely playing him. Tied a season low with 12 touches. We got almost as many combined pass routes from Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis as we got from Breece Hall. That's a huge red flag to me. Isaiah Davis played 6 total snaps before this past weekend, played 12 in that game, caught 3 passes. That to me tells me that Breece Hall's knee is not right, which is especially worrisome coming off a bye. Yeah. So we're going to have to watch him this week. If he did, in fact, miss Thursday's practice, I think that's a signal that things certainly didn't get any better than last week. He's already outside of RB1 range for us for week 14. And by the way, we have the same thing, best running back schedule from this week through the end of the fantasy season. He's already outside the top 12, though, despite having these 6 teams on bye and taking a lot of running backs with him. And he might drop even further if, the prognosis isn't much better at the end of the week.
Yeah, the one frustrating thing, too, is that if you've been handcuffing Breece Hall with Braylon Allen, I still think he's the handcuff for sure. He's played really well this year, but they used Isaiah Davis so much last week, especially as a receiver, right? And his routes run number really wasn't that bad. And you have to wonder if maybe they would deploy, a non-Breece Hall backfield with Braylon Allen being more of like an early down bruiser. And maybe they use Davis more. I like Davis a lot. I like both Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis a lot as prospects. And it sucked when they both got drafted to the same team. On a team with Breece Hall, nonetheless.
It double sucked. Because it sucked that they were drafted by the Jets. I was like, I guess I can forget about those guys for at least the next 3 years. And then they got drafted to the same team. I'm like, good God, guys.
Yeah, I was a big Isaiah Davis fan, but I like Braylon Allen a lot too. And my model loved him because of his age-adjusted production. But yeah, I do have now a little bit of concern. At least I want to voice the concern, right? That if Breece Hall is out, maybe Braylon Allen doesn't have the same 100% of the backfield share kind of juice that we once thought that he might have. Because there's other if Kyren Williams were to go down, knock on wood, I think we'd feel pretty good about Blake Corum just taking on a Kyren Williams role more than likely. Maybe not to the same degree, but pretty close.
Right, close.
Whereas now it's okay, if they're going to use Isaiah Davis in this way, if they like Isaiah Davis, then maybe it's not going to be as butterflies and rainbows as we thought with Braylon Allen.
I know. We spent all year thinking, at least Braylon Allen's the direct handcuff. I'm going to grab him now and we'll see what happens. If anything, he's taking too much work from Breece Hall. So we'll see. It's one game. Maybe this week will be different and Isaiah Davis won't play, but I don't know. That's the tough part of this job, is when people are asking us for our advice on something like this. And it's like, honestly, I don't know. I could fake and give you an answer and make it sound definite, but I'd be lying to you. Maybe that was one game. Maybe they really like Isaiah Davis and it took him this long to get it. Maybe the Jets have no clue what they're doing and every week is a crapshoot. So, we'll kind of have to see.
Yeah, I mean, look, running back, I say this all the time, but running back at the end of the day is a coaching decision, right? At least with wide receiver, we can really lean in on our talent evaluation and say, okay, this guy has to get open. We know he's going to be deployed. Although there's sometimes you get a team like the Buccaneers who deploys Jalen McMillan on the perimeter when he's a clear slot player and he's never going to be able to do the things that we want him to do given the role that they're giving him, right? That happens. But generally speaking, teams are going to deploy their wide receivers in the way that they deploy them, and we know that talent can win out because if they're open, et cetera, et cetera. With running backs, if they're not on the field, they're not on the field, right? That's been the hardest thing for me this week in particular with Sincere McCormick, right? Where like every data point, in my opinion, and look, as the week has gone on, I've gradually become more and more okay with like him as a potential thing, I guess. But like every data point, like he only had a 9% route share this past week. He hasn't been getting run throughout the season. It's not like he like I don't necessarily see this and I've seen the connection of Zamir White from last year, right? Where Josh Jacobs gets hurt, Zamir White steps in, and then he has not necessarily like a full-blown league winner stretch, but he was a very, very, he's a profitable back in the month of December. I'm having a hard time making that connection just because Sincere McCormick was not even the same type of prospect as Zamir White was. And, his route share wasn't there this past week. But it's one of those things, man, where you got to at least take a step back and be like, if Antonio Pierce and company want to use Sincere McCormick a lot more, then they might just do that, right? Like that still has to be part of our range of outcomes in the way that we're looking at this stuff. And that's kind of how I feel about like the Jets backfield. Like if they're just like, hey, we want to use Isaiah Davis more. Okay, well then I guess that's the decision that they're making at the end of the day. Also, am I wrong about Sincere McCormick? Like where are you at with Sincere McCormick?
If it takes this deep into a season that opened with Zamir White and Alexander Mattison leading your backfield for anybody to hear about you, then odds are against you making an impact on the rest of our fantasy season. Like people are asking if they should start him this week. His highlight is 12 carries for 64 yards for the Raiders. Right. I mean, cool, but I'm out.
Yeah, like I'm trying to just play probability at the end of the day, which is what you're doing. Like we fully recognize that anything can happen. Like I said, coaches can decide, oh, you know what, Sincere McCormick is going to be our bell cow now, right? But like to me, evidence just doesn't point that way. Where you had both Zamir White and Alexander Mattison sidelined, which Mattison, I think he was close last week even to stepping in and playing, but. Even if they're out, like I still think Amir Abdullah is going to play a pass catching role, and we still need that. We still need that part of a player's game more so than even some of the early down work that these guys are seeing.
And of course, you always have to leave open the possibility that you are wrong. Yeah. And maybe Sincere McCormick does get treated as the workhorse this week, but if I don't allow for that possibility in how I use him, what am I really going to miss out on? 20 carries for like 70 yards. Yeah. Maybe he finds the end zone. Like, sure, he could have a useful week, but I don't think that I'm missing anything special. Whereas if I said all the same things about Isaac Guerendo as a brand new rookie starter, I think that I could miss out on something huge.
Yeah, totally. What about Kenneth Walker? He's been struggling a lot. The Seahawks offensive line has struggled a lot. Do you think it's just an offensive line problem going on with him right now?
I think it's primarily an offensive line issue. I'm worried about that offense in general. And that the offense makes me worry about Kenneth Walker more than anything Kenneth Walker's doing. Over the first 7 weeks, that team averaged 368.3 yards, 25.7 points, past 5 games, 298 yards, 18.4 points. And the yardage gets a big boost from the Rams game. They scored defensive touchdowns the past 2 weeks. So it's been even worse than the numbers look like. So I'm worried about that offense. Walker's role has stayed good until this past week. And we were just talking about it with the Jets, where I want to see if last week was just the Seahawks playing catch up and Zach Charbonnet got some extra work there. And then if you look at that last scoring drive where Charbonnet wound up scoring the go-ahead touchdown from 8 yards out, it was mostly him on that drive. Kenneth Walker came in for 2 negative runs, which probably helped Charbonnet be the lead running back at the end of that drive. But what I'm a little bit concerned about and waiting to see is if the way that game ended makes the coaches say, all right, let's give Sharbs a bit more this week, get him more involved. So I think that adds some risk at the very least to Walker.
Yeah, I also think now that we're talking about this, I also think with a player like Walker, who He's great, like a very good running back. People are going to be sick of me saying this because I've talked about it a lot on the show over the last couple of years. He's a home run hitting back. Like he's not the most consistent runner in the world in terms of gaining positive yardage and doing that thing. But that also brings a ton more variance when the offensive line is playing poorly. Whereas if you get a guy like Charbonnet, who's more of that bruiser, I've always comped him to more of like a James Conner type. Like if you get that kind of player to kind of just grind out these yards, it might just be more favorable in this individual circumstance with the way the line's playing, the way the offense is playing. The coaching staff might give that a little bit more favor than they otherwise would. Not to say that Charbonnet is a better player than Walker. Walker's clearly more dynamic. I'm just saying, if you can't get Walker into space as easily, then that could be the part of the issue here.
And for what it's worth, too, Walker's still leading Charbonnet in most categories, most of the efficiency categories. I know that rush yards over expected leans Charbonnet's way, but just about everything else, yards per carry, not big leads, but slight leads still in Walker's favor. So it's not like, a couple of years ago with Jalen Warren behind Najee Harris, where there's this dynamic number two and a plotting number one. Yeah.
If anything, there's a plotting two and a dynamic number one when it comes to Seattle. All right. 2 more questions for you. The first one, are there any lower rostered players that you're stashing right now for the playoffs?
What I'm focusing on is handcuff running backs. And we've talked about some handcuff situations, but I think people this time of year are not focused enough on stashing the guys who will get the Guerendo bump. And, that's not one that we really could have foreseen because it took 2 injuries to push him in there. But Blake Corum this morning, Thursday morning, 22% rostered on Sleeper. That's way too low this time of year. If Kyron Williams goes down, it's probably going to be Blake Corum in at least close to the same role as Kyron Williams. Trey Benson, 28%. Ray Davis, 24%. Justice Hill, 30%. Kenneth Gainwell, 9%.
Yeah.
Sean Tucker, even 4% for deeper leagues who are like, all those guys are rostered in my league. Sean Tucker's got, a double handcuff situation.
Exactly.
We've seen him produce this year, and Bucky Irving is on the injury report this week with a couple of issues.
Yep.
So to me, that's the kind of guy that you're stashing. And then that way, when somebody goes down this Sunday and your whole league is rushing to the waiver wire to see how much they have to bid to get him, you're like, sorry, turkeys, I picked them up Saturday.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the thing too with Tucker, because I had Tucker on my 15 transaction. I called him out on 15 transactions this week too, because I think that a lot of times when you get a third string running back, people ignore that player because he's in the number 3, but when it's a split backfield to some degree, I mean, obviously Bucky Irving had a crazy backfield share last week, but when there's a split backfield, there's 2 outs for that player to at least, like, if one of those 2 gets hurt, Sean Tucker at least becomes like a flex play. Like, he's still someone that you might be able to throw in your lineup. A little bit different with Guerendo, as you noted, because CMC was a bell cow, and then there was someone behind him who we've seen as a, more of a workhorse type earlier this season. So there were a couple things that needed to happen for Guerendo, but I just want people to like think outside the box a little bit more with some of these injuries and how like guys could become relevant. Cause when there's multiple outs for these players, like we have with Sean Tucker, that's a big deal at the end of the day.
Yeah, the takeaway is not go pick up number 3 running backs because of Isaac Guerendo. It's look for spots where guys could have immediate opportunity and are available for free and go get them.
Yeah. All right, and then the last one I want to ask you, is there a lower key player out there that you think might be able to surprise us in the fantasy playoffs?
I'm not chasing too much outside of those handcuff running backs. I think I know I've gotten myself into trouble before by saying, but these matchups and these recent trends, and this guy I think might outscore this guy that's been a little bit disappointing. He's been okay. So I've found more trouble than help in doing that. I think there's a chance for like Dalton Schultz or Chigakonkwo for tight end needy teams. There's a chance that Nick Westbrook-Akine just continues being Marquez Valdez-Scantling the rest of the way. They've got a positive schedule, shallow wide receiver core. So I'm not saying count on him. He's not even inside our top 40 this week with 6 teams on bye, but he's like in a situation that could pop him into the top 25 at any given time.
Yeah, it's one of those things too, and I'm guilty of it because I literally just asked you this question, but people are always like, now who should I be stashing to win a champion? It's like, I would have told you if I, I'm not withholding information whenever I'm doing this stuff. Like, if there's someone that you should be rostering, I will let you know to roster that guy. So yeah, I feel you. I think that at the end of the day, like, for us to project, like, I don't think we're going to have like an Amon-Ra St. Brown, it probably would have already happened at this point. An Amon-Ra St. Brown rookie season kind of finish for any of these players, at least from a predictability standpoint.
Unless it's Sincere McCormick. Of course. Yes. We might see to me, it's going to be like something like we're just going to see a crazy run out, in my opinion, a crazy run out that was a little bit hard to predict, right? Like maybe like Elijah Moore goes nuts down the stretch or something. They have a tougher schedule, but like, just someone random like that's on a depth chart. Like you mentioned Nick Westbrook-Akine, just someone where, he's obviously been playing well recently because of the touchdown luck and the touchdown fortune, but I don't know if there's going to be like a predictable, you got to stash this in this particular guy. I think we'd have to just be a little bit more reactive to what happens. Yeah, I think in most cases, guys that are freely available right now are freely available for a reason. Their opportunities either not right there or they're not that good. I think we might be in the midst of Jakobi Meyers determining a lot more fantasy leagues than we ever would have guessed heading into the season.
That is the player on my mailbag episode that I said is my like if I were to pick, I picked two guys who might underperform in the playoffs. I picked DeAndre Swift and Najee Harris because they just have tough, like pretty brutal schedules. And then Jakobi Meyers was my guy to overperform. And every week I do my rest of season rankings, Matt, and I'm like 10 to 15 wide receiver spots ahead with Jakobi Meyers because no one seems to realize that the dude has like a 30% target share without Devontae Adams. Their schedule is cake down the stretch. So I really but maybe we can just hop on the Jakobi Meyers train and just say that that's the answer.
Absolutely. I mean, I enjoy him every year, but I wouldn't have been like, but watch, if Devontae Adams gets traded, he might be wide receiver 5, even better than Elijah Moore.
Never. I don't know. Let me ask you this though, before we head out here, because it kind of goes back to the Saquon discussion and some of the running back stuff that we talked about earlier. Like Jakobi Meyers, I think we would both agree is a good player, right? Like he's never been a bad player, but I wasn't heavily exposed to him this year. I haven't in some leagues, but like I wasn't heavily exposed to him this year for situation purposes. And look, I don't think he'd be doing this if Devontae Adams were still there, So do you think that like we should have leaned into Jakobi Meyers more, or is it still rational for us to have said, the situation's not that great. Devontae Adams is there. That's in Brock Bowers, obviously there. That's why I'm going to not be as heavy on him.
I think that we, should have leaned more into him at cost. He was like a wide receiver 5, 6. And that's always the takeaway from these guys. Because every year there are some guys, some wide receivers in that range where by this time of year, they're in the 20s and you're like, man, how did I miss it? It's because you thought they were a pretty good player. You just didn't think about this upside thing happening, that it was possible. Maybe it didn't even cross your mind. You didn't even decide whether it was or wasn't possible. It just didn't cross your mind. So that's what I try to do more with myself. It's like it's the hardest thing to do.
It's so hard because you also get so enamored with like rookies and like these, and that's the problem. But I think this is the big turn. And look, I preach talent all day long and like how talent creates opportunities and all that. But it's still so hard to actually like embrace that when you're drafting because it's such a boring pick at the end of the day.
Plus, you could lean into Jakobi Meyers and Jonathan Brooks at the same time. Then where would you be right now?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Matt, this was great. Always good catching up with you and talking fantasy football with you. Let everyone know where they can find you at DraftSharks.
Yeah, DraftSharks.com. We've got all our stuff up there. We've got Team Intel page that tells you how to set your lineup every week, so you don't have to ask me, although we still get people saying, I checked Team Intel, I checked the rankings, but who should I really start between these two running backs? I'm like, glad you asked, because you have to know the secret knock to find out who I'm starting. But we've got that. We've got all the tools there ready to help people manage their teams. I use them every week because I have too many teams for my own good. I miss a waiver run in at least one league every week. So it's helpful to have that kind of assistance.
Yeah. I mean, you guys do awesome work. It's always great talking to you. A lot of knowledge that you always drop, even IDP knowledge on this episode. You guys can
Who knew that was a thing?
Yeah. Who even realized that IDP existed? You guys can find all my stuff as usual over on lateround.com. Follow me on Twitter, on Blue Sky, all that at lateroundqb. Otherwise, everyone, thank you for tuning in.